Imagine discovering that the company where you work never really existed. In 1991, British investigators entered an elegant banking office in London and found something impossible: 13,000 employees registered on payroll. The problem? Only 300 real people worked there. The other 12,700 were ghosts. Ghosts who received salaries, who had bank accounts, who signed documents. Ghosts who help hide the biggest financial scandal you've never heard of, a criminal empire spanning 150 countries, involving dictators, intelligence agencies, arms dealers, and $1.5 billion that simply disappeared. The name of this bank was BCCI, Bank of Credit and Commerce International. And for 19 years, it operated the largest banking fraud in modern history, hidden in plain sight. In the next 25 minutes, I'm going to show you how a bank founded by a charismatic Pakistani transformed into a global criminal organization, how regulators in dozens of countries ignored obvious signs for nearly 2 decades, and how the most elaborate fraud of the 20th century was finally exposed. Because this isn't just the story of a corrupt bank. It's the story of how entire systems were designed to fail. To understand how this happened, we need to go back to 1972 and meet a man named Aga Hassan Abedi. Abedi was Pakistani, charismatic, and had an ambitious vision to create the first truly global third world bank. A bank that would serve developing countries ignored by Western institutions. Countries in Africa, Asia, the Middle East, regions rich in resources but poor in access to the international financial system. And I'll be honest with you, in the early years, BCCI seemed legitimate, revolutionary even. Abedi convinced Bank of America to invest 25% of the initial capital. He recruited executives from respected institutions. He opened branches in countries where no Western bank dared to operate. In just 5 years, BCCI was in 32 countries. But here's the detail no one noticed at the time. BCCI's corporate structure was strange. The bank was registered in Luxembourg, but its operational headquarters was in London. But its legal headquarters was in the Cayman Islands. But most operations happened in the Middle East and Asia. And the auditing? It was divided among multiple firms that never communicated. It was as if the bank had been designed to not be completely anywhere. And this wasn't an accident. It was the plan. Because while BCCI branches served legitimate clients, merchants, businessmen, expatriate workers sending money home, behind the scenes, Abedi was building something very different. He was building a bank for people who couldn't use normal banks. And I want to show you exactly who these people were. But first, you need to understand the tool that made all of this possible. Remember the 13,000 ghost employees I mentioned at the beginning? They were just one piece of a much larger system. BCCI operated through something called a matrix structure, a nice corporate term for a deliberately chaotic network of accounts, subsidiaries, and shell entities scattered across 73 countries. Here's how it works. Let's say you're an African dictator who just embezzled $50 million from the national treasury. You can't simply deposit it at Chase or Citibank. They'd ask questions. But at BCCI, you deposit it at a branch in Panama. The money is transferred to a corporate account in the Cayman Islands registered under a shell company. That company lends the money to another subsidiary in Dubai. Dubai invests in a fund in the Bahamas. The fund buys real estate in London. After passing through 12 countries and 30 transactions, that $50 million is completely clean, legal, impossible to trace. And here's the brilliant trick. Because BCCI was audited by different firms in each jurisdiction, no auditors saw the complete picture. The London firm only saw British operations. The Luxembourg firm only saw European records. It was like assembling a puzzle where each person could only see one piece. But the ghost employees? Those were the genius final touch. BCCI registered thousands of employees on payroll in jurisdictions with little oversight. These fake employees had real bank accounts that received real salaries. And these accounts were used to move money illegally without raising suspicion. Because if you see 500 transfers of $10,000 leaving a corporate account, that looks suspicious. But if you see 500 transfers of $10,000 from individual employee accounts, that looks normal. And now that you understand the machine, I need to show you who was using it. BCCI wasn't just a corrupt bank. It was a global criminal cafeteria. And its client list was a who's who of the worst people on the planet. Manuel Noriega, the Panamanian dictator involved in cocaine trafficking, BCCI client. Saddam Hussein, before the Gulf War, moved funds through BCCI. The Medellin cartel, including Pablo Escobar, used BCCI to launder billions in drug money. Abu Nidal, the Palestinian terrorist responsible for attacks in 20 countries, maintained accounts at BCCI. But it gets worse. Subsequent investigations reveal that BCCI actively facilitated arms trafficking, financed human trafficking networks, helped North Korea acquire nuclear technology, and operated as an informal bank for the ISI, Pakistan's intelligence agency. Here's the most bizarre detail. BCCI also had clients on the good side. The CIA used BCCI for covert operations in Afghanistan during the war against the Soviet Union. British intelligence agencies maintained secret accounts there because BCCI offered something no legitimate bank could: absolute secrecy and zero questions. So we have a bank that simultaneously served terrorists and Western intelligence agencies, dictators and democratic governments, drug traffickers and legitimate investors. And for 19 years, no one did anything. Or rather, many people knew. But there were very specific reasons not to act. And this is where the story gets truly disturbing. In 1978, just 6 years after BCCI was founded, the U.S. Federal Reserve had already identified questionable banking practices. In 1983, investigators in India found evidence of money laundering on a massive scale. In 1985, an internal auditor from BCCI itself sent a report to senior executives warning of systematic fraud and misappropriation of funds. In 1988, the Bank of England received reports of suspicious activities in British operations. So why did nothing happen? Because BCCI had become too big and too connected to fail. Think about it, the bank operated in 73 countries. It had 1.5 million depositors, most of them poor immigrant workers sending money to families. It employed 14,000 real people, plus the 13,000 ghosts. If the bank collapsed, the impact would be devastating. But the real truth, the inconvenient truth no one wanted to admit, regulators in dozens of countries were completely incompetent, or corrupt, or both. The Bank of England knew something was wrong, but didn't want the scandal of admitting that one of the largest banks operating in London was fraudulent. The U.S. Federal Reserve knew, but BCCI was technically outside their legal jurisdiction. Regulators in Panama, the Cayman Islands, Luxembourg, they benefited from the billions flowing through their jurisdictions. And here's the detail that makes me furious. BCCI wasn't hiding its operations particularly well. The corporate structure was obviously suspicious. The transactions were blatantly illegal. The signs were everywhere. But no one wanted to be the first to light the fuse. Until someone finally did. In 1988, DEA agents, the U.S. Anti-Drug Agency, conducted an undercover operation called Sea Chase. They posed as criminal businessmen wanting to launder money for the Medellin cartel. And guess which bank the traffickers themselves recommended? BCCI. The operation resulted in 85 arrests and exposed, for the first time publicly, BCCI's involvement in drug money laundering on an industrial scale. But even then, the bank continued operating. Because here's the problem, the DEA charges were only about BCCI's U.S. operation. Global operations remained untouched. Until in 1990, an auditor called Pricewaterhouse was hired to conduct a complete and independent audit of all BCCI's global operations. And what they found was much, much worse than money laundering. BCCI had been technically insolvent for at least 5 years. The capital reserves the bank reported? Fictitious. The assets? Overvalued by billions of dollars. The loans that appeared in the books? Many were to shell companies controlled by BCCI itself. It was a banking Ponzi scheme. The bank was using deposits from new clients to cover losses from old operations. It was inventing profits that didn't exist. It was reporting reserves that were completely fake. And the cherry on top? At least $1.5 billion had simply disappeared. No one knew where it was. When the Pricewaterhouse report reached regulators in July 1991, there was no more ignoring it. On July 5, 1991, simultaneously in 69 countries, regulatory agencies executed a coordinated operation. At 1 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time, the Bank of Credit and Commerce International was shut down worldwide. But closing the bank was just the beginning of the story. The real horror was what was about to be discovered. When investigators finally gained full access to BCCI's records, they found a file of horrors that went far beyond banking fraud. Discovery number 1: the secret control network. BCCI secretly controlled or owned stakes in several legitimate banks around the world through proxies and shell companies, including, and this is absolutely insane, illegal stakes in American banks. They had circumvented laws prohibiting unauthorized foreign ownership of U.S. financial institutions. Discovery number 2: the Black Files. In a vault in Abu Dhabi, investigators found detailed files of illegal operations, records of bribes paid to hundreds of government officials, politicians, and regulators in 92 countries. It was basically a complete map of global corruption. Discovery number 3: the Phantom Real Estate Empire. BCCI had purchased hundreds of luxury properties around the world using depositors' money. Mansions in London, hotels in Paris, resorts on tropical islands, all registered under shell company names. When the bank failed, these properties were worth billions, but couldn't be easily traced or recovered. Discovery number 4: the Forgotten Depositors. 1.5 million people had money in BCCI. Most were poor workers, Filipinos in Dubai, Pakistanis in London, Africans in Europe. People who had saved for years. After a liquidation process that lasted 15 years, depositors received back, on average, 70% of what they had deposited. 30 cents on every dollar. Simply gone. And as for the 1.5 billion that disappeared, most of it was never recovered. Investigators believe it was moved to secret accounts in jurisdictions without international cooperation. Tax havens that, to this day, protect banking secrets. But here's the most disturbing truth of all. Of the 13,000 people indicted in connection with the BCCI scandal in multiple countries, only 200 were actually tried. Fewer than 50 were imprisoned. And no senior executive served more than 5 years in prison. Aga Hassan Abedi, the founder, he was never formally charged. He died in 1995 in Pakistan, protected by political connections. So what did the collapse of BCCI change? In the immediate years, a lot. There were regulatory reforms. The Basel Committee on Banking Supervision created new international standards. Countries improved, theoretically, coordination between agencies. But here's the question that haunts me. The same structural problems that enabled BCCI still exist today. Tax havens still operate with absolute secrecy. Banks still structure operations across multiple jurisdictions to avoid oversight. Regulators are still slow, fragmented, and often ineffective. And when similar scandals happen, and they do happen, the consequences are rarely proportional to the crime. BCCI operated for 19 years in plain sight because global oversight systems were designed to have holes. Holes that smart, malicious people can exploit. And the uncomfortable truth is this: as long as there are jurisdictions willing to offer secrecy, as long as there are regulators willing to look the other way, as long as there are systems complex enough to hide fraud, there will be a next BCCI. Only next time, it'll probably be even bigger, even more complex, even harder to dismantle. Because that's the real lesson of the Bank of Credit and Commerce International. For 19 years, BCCI was the world's most dangerous bank. It served dictators, terrorists, and traffickers. It laundered billions in dirty money. It created 13,000 fake employees. And when it finally collapsed, $1.5 billion had disappeared into thin air. But the scariest part, it wasn't how much they stole. It was how long it took for someone to do something about it. And how many people in positions of power knew and chose to ignore it. If this story of systematic corruption and global regulatory failure made you rethink how the financial system really works, leave a like on this video. Because the more people understand how these frauds happen, the harder it becomes to repeat the same mistakes. And if you want to discover more corporate scandals the mainstream media never covered, I left a video here about the collapse of the Carrion Group, a Hong Kong real estate empire that disappeared overnight, taking $10 billion with it. It's equally insane. Subscribe to the channel because every week I cover cases like this, obscure corporate frauds, mysterious collapses, and buried scandals. And tell me in the comments, had you ever heard of BCCI? Because I bet you hadn't. And that's exactly the kind of story that needs to be told.